Thanks very much, Sandhya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for all coming out, and how appropriate that we should be in the Monash libraries. And as you'll see, there are plenty of reasons to reinforce that name in this state. Some of you might have been wondering what you've been watching. All of those red poppies. They're part of the 5,000 Poppies project, which was started in Melbourne nearly 4 years ago. 4 years ago we're up to, by two girls out of Glen Iris who wanted to knit 50 poppies to tie around a tree in the domain to honour their respective Second World War fathers. Their friends got a hold of them and they started knitting and crocheting and said, why don't you lift the target and see if you can do 5,000 for ANZAC Day 2015. So that's how 5,000 Poppies started. They got themselves a little blog site and they started beavering away with their needles. And cutting a long story short, I got involved with them, and we think there's probably now 600,000 or 700,000 of these poppies. Each one of them different. Many of them have buttons from original tunics. Many have them little tributes sewn into them to particular individuals. They've come from all over Australia, all over the world in fact. Some have come from Turkey, some from Russia. There's now similar projects in the UK and New Zealand. And along the way they have been displayed here in the most extraordinary circumstances. First displayed ANZAC Day 2015 in Federation Square two nights before. And we laid them out there and people came up and started crying straight away. And then they were overnight before ANZAC Day in the pouring rain laid out on Princess Bridge, and from there they've been at the International Flower and Garden Show in Melbourne, and you've seen the display of 330,000 that went to the Chelsea Flower Show 2 years ago. 2 years ago now, it isn't, yeah, 2 years ago. Some of them on mats, some of them on little stems, each and every one of them different. Anybody here been to the Chelsea Flower Show in London? It's on a particular piece of ground. The flower show occupies one bit of ground, the Royal Chelsea Hospital, where the Chelsea pensioners in their long red coats, and you saw them, they live there. And it's been no man's land between for over 100 years. No correspondence, no engagement. And through Philip Johnson, the Melbourne landscape architect who we got to do this work, he'd won a gold medal at the Chelsea Flower Show. He brought the two groups together. And on day one, it was a case of don't you dare step over that line, to when we were packing up, they're all embracing each other and having a good cry because it had been such a success. We'd brought people together and we'd commemorated the Australian contribution. Now why I'm mentioning all of that is because we just wanted to show it to you to start with. But part of the rules of engagement today is that you don't get to leave here today unless you've already knitted a poppy, show of hands, or you promised to knit one, including the blokes. Now, we made that commitment, we got that commitment out of just about everybody who visited the Chelsea Flower Show. We were there for 8 days, and standing in that crowd you saw, even the royal family, a whole lot of them came and watched. We even had a minister, a UK minister, come down, and she spent an hour and a half with us. She was fantastic, really engaging, interested, and 6 weeks later she was Prime Minister, Theresa May. We got the crowd to commit to knitting these, so all the guys have got to commit. You don't have to do it today, but you've got to do it before you go home. And what's all of this about? Well, each and every one of these is a collection of threads. It's a collection of connections. And what we're seeking, welcome the councillor, what we're seeking to do is make connections. And when we set out on the ANZAC Centenary mission, we gave ourselves 5 simple objectives. Obviously to honour those who served and sacrificed. Secondly, to educate particularly younger generations, because people have forgotten about the First World War and Australia's contribution. we of course wanted to pass the torch. There's nobody over the age of 40 here, is there, today? Yes. So we want to pass the torch to the even younger generation. And we wanted to leave a richer legacy, more information, more availability, more stories that people can access, more connections. And we wanted to strengthen alliances with all of those involved, no matter which side they happen to be on in the First World War. And we now have very strong relationships with Turkey, of course, for instance. And we said we were going to do this by not doing just the traditional thing. The traditional thing with commemoration is have an event, have a speaker, raise the flag, say the ode, sing the anthem, kids line up, they know what to do, everyone's respectful. That's all great. But 24 hours later, no one can remember what happened. Can you remember what happened on ANZAC Day this year? Can you remember what happened on November the 11th last year? That's not an atypical reaction. That's what happens with traditional commemoration. What we're trying to do is find connections, threads of connections, the contemporary generations to those First World War generations, those who served, sacrificed. And there are plenty of ways of doing it. You can obviously do it by family connection. And there will be some people here who know they had a family connection. Others perhaps think they didn't. And then we can probably show that you did. But family connection fades over time. You perhaps don't think that's the case. But quick show of hands again. Raise your hand if you can name both your parents' family names. Keep them up if you can name all 4 of your grandparents' family names. What about all 8 of your great-grandparents' family names? That's the typical reaction. And bear in mind, if you've got grandparents, or you knew your grandparents, for your own grandchildren, your grandparents are their great-great-grandparents. And they are very unlikely to know them or know about them or remember their names. Family connections do fade over time. There are connections. They're harder to keep with us. There are other connections, multicultural groups. Most Australians don't realise that we had Russian original ANZACs, Chinese original ANZACs, we had Jewish original ANZACs, Greek original ANZACs, we had Chilean original ANZACs, Indigenous original ANZACs. So there are opportunities to connect through multicultural groups. There are opportunities to connect through institutions. Obviously churches, sporting clubs, those sort of things. And you can go to some of our churches and see honour boards there, and perhaps we don't pay those honour boards enough attention. We can connect through occupation. We now have records, so we can press a button and tell you in very short time who were the police officers who went in the first convoy in October 1914. And we did that with Victoria Police. They didn't have that information. They now do, and they were able to address their commemoration to those issues. And you can obviously connect through a country town. And there are plenty of them around Victoria who have memorials in those towns. They're extraordinary memorials. You can also connect through residential connections. Anybody here live in a home that's more than 100 years old? Not so many around this particular patch, but there certainly are around Oakley. And before I left Parliament, I was able to write to 1,000 of my constituents in Hawthorn, a little bit of Camberwell and Hawthorn, all of whom owned homes that were once occupied by original ANZACs. And we were able to connect those who live in the home with those who served from that home. And Kathy was here with me. She went across the road to the little Weatherport house across the road from her, took the records of 3 boys. And the little kids in that home said, "You mean they slept in our rooms?" "Yes." "You mean they walked through our door?" "Yes." "You mean they walked down our street? They looked out the same windows?" "Yes." And the little kids put their arms around those original ANZACs as if they were family. It's a connection. So we tried to focus on connections, not just traditional stuff, and that's why the Poppies project we thought was a very attractive one, and why we're just thrilled that it's so successful and it's still going. And they're looking for knitters and crocheters already, still, and they have targets for next year, and there'll be a final end of the commemorations in November the 11th next year in Canberra, and these will feature. And these will feature in the weeks ahead as well, we hope. When it comes to connections, Winston Churchill had this to say shortly after the war ended. And amongst other things, he was talking about Australia in 100, 200 and 300 years' time. And he said, amongst other things, Australians will look back and every family will seek to trace some connection to these events and to those who served and sacrificed. He understood, and we're trying to get everybody else to understand, but each and every one of these has got those threads of connection. And if you've knitted one of these, you'll never forget it. And if you're a bloke and you've knitted one of these, not only will you never forget it, but all your mates will never forget it. So I'd urge you, just go on 5,000, you can Google 5,000 poppies, and they're still wanting more. We think by the end of it, they'll probably have up to 900,000, possibly even 1 million of these. They're now all over Australia. Where have they been going? They've been going to a garage in Glen Iris in someone's home. There are no cars parked in that garage anymore. So as we've set out to do this commemoration, we've been asking ourselves all sorts of questions. Who made the greatest contribution? Who was the greatest? In fact, if we think about it now, there's a pretty good dinner party game you can play now, which is who's the most respected world leader currently. It's a tricky game. Then you can play the game, well, who's the most respected Australian leader at the moment? I won't get into that, but that's a bit of politics. And then, who's the greatest Australian of all? And then I would contend, and many others do, including King George, that it was John Monash. And here's a bit of footage that most Australians have never seen. King George decided in 1918 that John Monash was the greatest of all. And he did what no one had done for hundreds of years, no monarch had done for hundreds of years, and knighted John Monash in the field at the front. And they went to the chateau at Betangles, Betangla, I think it is the French. And here is an example of how to do ceremony. We take ceremony, we turn into a 3-hour event. So King George has walked up to the villa at Betangle with Monash. They step outside. Monash kneels down, tap on the shoulder, arise Sir John. Ceremony over. That's how you do a ceremony. Think about how much time we waste on ceremonies when they manage to do that. Who's seen that before? Anybody seen that before? It's available on YouTube, and you should get kids to have a look at it. It's a fascinating thing. So it's certainly my contention that John Monash is our greatest soldier ever, changed the course of the war, recognised by King George as doing so, despite the fact that all the British military didn't want to have anything to do with that. He as Roland Perry, the author, said in his biography of Monash, he won the war. But he was more than that. He's a great educator, a great Australian, great Victorian, Chancellor of, Vice-Chancellor of Victorian, of Melbourne University, set up the SEC. He is, in my view, the greatest Australian of all time. And I challenge you to have a think about that test through the rest of the day and maybe around the dinner table tonight. Who's the greatest currently and who's the greatest ever? And Monash certainly fits the bill. But not everybody thinks so. This is a 3-set volume, the Cambridge History of the First World War. And if you're wondering why I'm moving slowly, I've got a terrible bad back, and as soon as I picked that up, my back has gone, whoa, it doesn't like the weight. There's a couple of thousand pages in this. 100 of the world's best historians wrote, and this was published 2 or 3 years ago, and I was asked to launch it in Victoria, and I happily did that. I didn't realise at the time that the editor, Professor Jay Winter, was going to be in the audience, but I discovered just in time. And who's Jay Winter? Jay Winter is listed here as the Charles J. Still Professor of History at Yale University and Distinguished Visiting Professor at Monash University, one of the founders of the Historial de la Grande Guerre, the International Museum of the Great War in Péronne-Somme, France. And he received an Emmy Award for the Best Documentary Series. He, in his own right, an established historian, edited 100 of the world's greatest historians to put this new history of the First World War together. So I had a look at this, but obviously if I'm going to launch it, I'm going to read it. And I was stunned. In the history of the First World War, written by the 100 most distinguished historians in the world, not a single mention of John Monash. Not a single mention. However, there is one mention, and that was the one I just read to you, that Jay Winter is a distinguished professor at Monash University. Now, he was in the audience, and I think he realised the blue. I had been planning to launch the book by dropping the book, or books, in deference. I merely pointed it out, and there was a bit of shuffling going on. I haven't heard from them since, but there you go. But that's one of the problems we face with John Monash. For a variety of reasons, he was shunned during the war, and he's been shunned since the war. He was shunned, many say, because he was Jewish, some say because he had German parents, some say because he was a colonial, some say because he wasn't a professional soldier, he was a volunteer. None of them sound reasons. But if you look at his record, it's a staggering record. And we'll go through some of that. And we remember him now, in many different ways. Here we are at the Monash Library. In the city of Monash, I think we are. And here are just some of the institutions that carry Monash's name. And many of you will have multiple $100 bills in your pocket. If you could share those around and just show people that Monash's face appears on the $100 bill. We have gone to some trouble to put his name in lights. Monash University did a survey some years ago, not so long ago, of all of their students. 95% of them didn't know that Monash was named after an individual, let alone after or who the individual was. So we have some work to do. For most young people, Monash means the university they didn't go to, the council that gave them a parking ticket, or the freeway that isn't free and is stationary. That's what Monash means to them. So we've got some work to do to make the connection to Monash with younger generations. Indeed, older generations as well, because probably some people of our vintage who still don't make the connection. Monash was born in Melbourne, and one of the great outcomes of Monash's life that he was an engineer, became a prominent engineer, and every day Victorians still drive over Monash bridges. You probably don't recognise it, but if you happen to be Premier at some time in the future, and you happen to be overseeing a flood response, then you'll discover that the bridges that don't have debris piled on top of them or haven't been flooded are the Monash bridges, because right across Victoria they were beautifully set and beautifully constructed, beautifully designed. The most prominent one for us is obviously Princess Bridge, and Monash was instrumental in Princess Bridge. He was given a terribly hard time by those who gave approvals, and some of his bridges were tested with heavy weights until they collapsed. Monash learnt from any of that, and his bridges have stood the test of time. So every day Monash is touching us still. You'll probably recognise some of them. Some of them you would have been across, never given it a moment's thought. And put yourself back 110, 120 years ago when these were being designed with limited resources and the wisdom that's gone into them. Monash obviously served militarily and, as many have observed, instrumental in changing the course of the war. He went through Gallipoli. Like everybody, it wasn't a good experience for him, but he probably did better at Gallipoli with the troops than many of his peers. He survived Gallipoli and went back to Egypt, and it was Monash who started the tradition of ANZAC Day, handing out to the troops ribbons, red ribbons for those who were at the landing, blue ribbons for those who served at Gallipoli but weren't at the landing. And it was from that experience in 1916 that Anzac Day emerged, and Monash was responsible for that. Born in Melbourne, and we'll come back to where he was born. Educated in a variety of places. Supposedly met Ned Kelly up in the north when the family moved up there. Parents Jewish, German. Went to Scotch College, wasn't the world's best student, but ended up being dux of the school at a relatively young age. And went to Melbourne University. Again, not the greatest student in the world initially, failed, but he got through, graduated. At the same time, not only graduated in a couple of areas, but he also became a very accomplished musician in his own right. And in all, Monash was a military genius, an engineer, a lawyer, an aesthete, an educator, an artist, a writer, an extraordinary individual. He married and had one child, and some of you will remember Monia pipes, reinforced concrete. Monash was the man. Every day, a bit of Monash is below the ground around us or in our walls. He took up volunteer militia service. At the time, Australia was believed to be under threat from either the Germans or the Russians or somebody else, so there was a young nation with lots of gold, so volunteer militia were initiated. And along the way, you look at 1910 there, Monash ran in January 1910 military manoeuvres in the Avenel and Seymour area with 12,000 uniformed volunteers. It's equivalent to about 80,000 people invading Avenel and Seymour today. Extraordinary numbers. And that exercise was overseen by the Secretary of State who became the Secretary of State for World War I, Lord Kitchener. So Kitchener met Monash 4 years before the war and knew of his attributes, knew him as a volunteer. And then even 6 months before the war, Monash ran military manoeuvres at Lilydale, and there it is, and Coldstream. And I think it was 3,000, remember, 3,000 uniformed volunteers marching into Lilydale and conducting war games at Coldstream. And that's the encampment. So this is amongst all the other things Monash was doing and in anticipation of any threats that might come to Australia. Obviously, the war started in 1914, in August 1914, and the first troops left from Flinders Street and went by train up to Sydney. The first large groups of troops from Australia left in October 1914 from Port Melbourne. And when war was announced, someone's mobile telephone went off in the middle of that announcement. The news was greeted with wild enthusiasm in Melbourne. Crowds gathered out the town hall, and the newspapers reported that Melburnians and Victorians were thrilled with the announcement. And some people don't remember that between 1901 and 1927, Melbourne was the capital of Australia. Should have stayed that way. While I was Premier, I was trying to revert to that, and that's why I'm now where I am. And the decision to go to war was made in a meeting room in the corner of Collins Street and Spring Street, number 1 Collins Street. And there were only half a dozen ministers there, and it was in the middle of an election campaign, and the decision was made by a caretaker government with half a dozen ministers. Hard to imagine that happening in this day and age, but that's what happened. And the opposition quickly got up and said they agreed, so it wasn't an issue. The election was held, the government lost, and we got a new Prime Minister in the course of just a few weeks. But the first troops to leave were in October 1914, and all the troops that left were marched through the streets. That's Collins Street on the 25th of September 1914, looking west up the hill towards what's now Southern Cross Station. Anybody remember what happened 100 years to the day after that in Collins Street? 25th of September 2014. Grand final parade. Big crowds in Collins Street. The weather was almost precisely the same. You can see the umbrellas. Huge crowds though here. And all the troops were marched through the streets, and they were taken down to Port Melbourne, and they went in convoys. And that continued for some years. The crowds were very enthusiastic. You can see the streamers being thrown to the boys on the ships. Those who enlisted and went early were given the specific impression that they'd be home by Christmas. It was an adventure. Monash himself left in the second convoy in 1914, in December I think it was, December 1914, and there he is with his wife. He left on the Ulysses, wife and daughter. 1915, they obviously all went to Egypt. Monash went to Egypt as well. The troops gathered and in Egypt, trained in Egypt, and then they were summoned in April to go to Lemnos and on to Gallipoli. And we all know the story, we all know the tragedy. Monash was part of that tragedy. He wrote extensively about it. He managed to maintain a positive relationship with his troops, and he, probably more than anybody else, fought to overturn decisions that were made, tragic and ill-considered decisions. But I think even he would have conceded that he was unsuccessful in that, and so many died needlessly as a consequence. At the end of 1915, the Prime Minister, Baillieu, who was, by that stage, Fisher, the Prime Minister, had packed it in under pressure, and Hughes had become Prime Minister. He put out a call to arms for more troops, and that started, and we had this swamp of troops. At this stage, Australians didn't know what had happened at Gallipoli. They just weren't aware, and probably still many aren't. 1916, the focus turned to France, the Western Front. Monash there as well, and the tragedies of 1916, Fromelles and others like it. And you saw before the poppies that were placed, 33,000 poppies placed in the ground at the Fromelles Memorial 2 years ago. And again, Monash marking ANZAC Day. The figures of those who were killed and wounded are staggering, and it went on and on. And there's a very sobering fact: there wasn't a victory for 3 years. Imagine being on the losing side with so many troops dying for 3 years. That's what we were facing. Quick show of hands, who's been to the Somme or the Western Front? Some of you have. It is incredibly sobering to go there. I was there about 6 or 7 weeks ago myself again. 1917, 100 years ago this day today, right now. We can press a button and get these figures now, which is part of that legacy of more information. But to think 124 Australians died 100 years ago today. Many of them were Victorians. Many of them will be names that people recognise. 1917, again, the Western Front, but also the Middle East, and you'll recognise the names Bullecourt, Mézine, Passchendaele, and we've just been through the 100th anniversary of Passchendaele. And all the while Monash is there, working with the troops and trying to inject a new dimension to it. And look at those figures, a further 76,000 Australian casualties. We quite rightly get very moved by the death of a single Australian soldier. How do you cope with 124 in one day and 76,000 casualties in a few months? It wasn't until October 1917 there was a victory, Beersheba, in the Middle East, and we're coming up to that centenary in the next week, a week or two. And that was the beginning of the turnaround of fortunes. But the war's still going on on the Western Front, and Monash is there amongst it. and again in 1918. And in 1918, Monash was promoted to the commander of Australian troops, and at the Battle of Hamel, he entered his first major command of a battle. He predicted that he could achieve victory in 90 minutes, and I think it took him just over 90 minutes. And that's when the world of the military started to really take notice of Monash. There are his original trench maps, and just a few weeks later, at the Battle of Amiens, Monash did it again with pioneering military techniques which no one had considered before. He coordinated the services, coordinated everything around it, and the troops loved him for it. He scared the willies out of the enemy troops, and that's how King George came to knight Monash in the field. And you look at the numbers, they're just shocking numbers. Obviously the war ended officially on November the 11th, 1918. Billy Hughes had been to the front twice during that time, once for more than a year, once for more than 6 months. Imagine a Prime Minister absenting himself from the country these days for 4 weeks, let alone 4 months, let alone a year. Hughes was at the front, and Hughes wasn't a great fan of Monash. And in fact, he saw Monash and the love the troops had for Monash as a rival. And hence, Hughes assigned Monash the task of staying in London and repatriating the troops. And there were a lot of them, and it took a long time. It had taken a long time to get them all there, and those who survived had to be returned. And they weren't all returned until February 1920. So we'll mark the centenary of that in February 2020. Monash himself returned in January of that year. So he didn't return until January 1920. He didn't just stop when he came back. He started the most extraordinary contribution to Victorian society. Through the university, he established the State Electricity Commission. Without John Monash, you wouldn't be switching on the power. Every time you switch on the power, you're switching on John Monash. It was Monash who opened up the Latrobe Valley, which gave Victoria its competitive advantage, which has lasted until just a couple of years ago, where we had the cheapest power, where we had abundant power. And now, for one reason or another, we've abandoned that as one of our key features in Victoria. It was Monash who did it. And there's a famous story that Monash, having put a proposal to the state government of the day, was rebutted by the cabinet. So Monash turned up at the cabinet, and he went to the cabinet, and they're sitting, and he said to the Premier, well, I understand that you're opposed to my idea, so I thought I'd come and check because you must have the wrong understanding. And he proceeded to explain it, and they switched their decision and approved it by the time he left. And to this day, there's a bust of John Monash at the door to cabinet. And if you're a smart minister, you stroke him on the shoulder or pat him on the head on the way in. And get a dose of reality, a dose of getting it done, and a dose of not wasting time, and a dose of taking advantage of Victoria's competitive position. Not sure everybody does it, but it's right there as a reminder. And Monash did so much more. At the time, there was still massive unrest in the Australian community. There was unhappiness with the government of the day. And out of Sydney in particular, a significant group of business people decided they should undertake a coup on the Australian government, a military coup, and John Monash should be installed as dictator of Australia. And they approached Monash. It was we giggle about it. It's so hard to fathom now, but it was real. They were resourced and they had intention. And they approached Monash. We want you to be the man. And Monash wrote back to them. And some of you will be able to read this, but let me just read it to you if you can't. Monash wrote, "What do you and your friends want me to do? To lead a movement to upset the Constitution, oust the jurisdiction of Parliament and usurp the governmental power? If so, I have no ambition to embark on high treason, which any such action would amount to. What would you say if a similar proposal were made by the communists and socialists to seize political power for the benefit of the proletariat and the extinction of the bourgeoisie, as they've done in Russia? Would you not call that revolution and treason to the Crown and Constitution? Depend upon it, he wrote. The only hope for Australia is the ballot box and an educated electorate. You and your people should get busy and form an organisation as efficient, as widespread and as powerful as that of the Labor Party. It just happened to be the government of the day. It wasn't a political commentary. He ended the letter with a very powerful line, and he said, if it be true that many people in Sydney are prepared to trust my leadership, they should be prepared also to trust my judgment. He said no, and the coup was defeated. And the irony of that is what would have happened if Monash had accepted and the government had been rolled? Most Australians don't know this story. If we'd had a military coup, we think military coups are about third world countries and rotten military regimes. It was real. It nearly happened here. Monash was the man. He would have been swept to power. The tragedy is Monash died 6 months later. What then would have happened? And there's a lesson in what Monash had to say in that correspondence. Who's written a letter recently? Not many. We don't write letters much anymore. Monash left 75,000 letters behind when he died. And that letter was one of them. It's an extraordinary contribution from an extraordinary individual. He did so many miraculous things, and we've only touched on it. But I mentioned that he had been the progenitor of ANZAC Day commemorations. When he returned in the 1920s, ANZAC Day was flailing. And the government finally asked Monash for some help. So he agreed, and he put out the call to former troops, and he rode the white horse at the front of the march, and 600,000 people turned up. It was Monash who, when the police went on strike in Victoria, it was the government turned to Monash. He turned to his troops, and his former troops put the strike down. He was the go-to man, but he was above the self part of it. He was only interested in the longer-term outcomes. He would be the first to admit he wasn't perfect. He had all his faults of his own. But what an extraordinary Australian, and very sadly not well enough known by younger generations. What of his homes? 58 Dudley Street in West Melbourne. Anyone been there? Doesn't have a plaque on it. Clifton Street in Richmond, a little short street in Richmond, Germania Cottage. You've done the tour of the Monash houses. Many others. And none of them have plaques on them. Some of the owners are a bit shy about it. We've approached some of them. There's the array of them. There are probably other places as well. There's Dudley Street. There's Germania Cottage. It's got a different fence, but it's all there and still got the Germania Cottage sign on it in little street in Richmond Hill. This one's now got a little office block in front of it, but the building's still there in Hawthorn. This is another, well, it's not the house, but it's the location of one of the places where he lived, and one just across the road. Likewise, that's the only one that has a plaque. And you'd think there'd be a plaque on the home where John Monash was born, but no, we haven't got to that yet. This is in St George's Road, Toorak. Beautiful home, Iona, where he died. It was all demolished, and there's a little laneway down the side called Monash Drive, and that's the only thing that acknowledges that he lived there. He's buried in Brighton Cemetery, in the Jewish section, very humble grave, and there are some suitable plaques on that, and you can get directed to that. But he was a proud Jew, and he was ensured that he was buried there. Along the way, as chairman of ANZAC Centenary in Victoria, we've had all sorts of people provide all sorts of information to us. And Kathy and I have an office which is just flooded with books and personal histories and all sorts of things. And a gentleman from down this way, who was at a workshop down this way, rang up and said he'd been asked to clear out a warehouse, I think it was, in Port Melbourne about 10 years before. And there was an honour board in it. He'd salvaged the honour board. And would I like to come and have a look? He thought I might be interested. So I got in the car and went down and had a look, and there's the honour board. And it's the honour board from 360 Collins Street. Now, if you'd been looking carefully at the military record we popped up for Monash before, it gave his address as 36 Collins Street, which is the address of the Melbourne Club, which tragically didn't admit Jews. But it was a little typo. His address was 360 Collins Street, was where he had an office as a lawyer. And the military records are full of errors. They're full of typos. They're full of fibs. The boys lied about their age. They lied about their addresses. They lied about their religion. Some of them changed their religion midstream in order to get Saturdays off. Enlisting officers made mistakes with addresses, with names. They're full of mistakes. That's part of the history. But this honour board had Monash's name on it. You can see it just here. It's in the middle. And I thought that was pretty impressive. And then the fellow who was showing it to us pointed out there were a couple of Baillius on the honour board. And we can't quite see those. And they were relatives of my grandfather. And then there's the name W.J. Knox on the top left there, MC. And you remember I mentioned the troops went off to Egypt, and then they went to Lemnos and Gallipoli. W.J. Knox went to Egypt and went to Lemnos and boarded the ship called the Southland. And on board was a young boy named Jimmy Martin. And W.J. Knox got off just before the ship left, got on the ship behind because his brother was on the ship behind. And he watched the Southland be torpedoed and wrote back to his family about it being torpedoed. Jimmy Martin lived at 43 Mary Street in Hawthorne. And he wrote every day to his parents. And he wrote about the Southland being torpedoed from on board. They both survived. They went off to Gallipoli. Sadly, Jimmy Martin died at Gallipoli. W.J. Knox went on to France. When Jimmy Martin died, he was 14 years old. He'd fibbed to his parents about, or he'd fibbed on the enlistment forms, and he'd said to his parents, if you don't let me go, I'm going to go anyway and I'll never write to you. So they signed up. And Jimmy went as a 14-year-old, never came back. Went on the same ship as W.J. Knox. And no doubt they probably had an arm around each other at some stage. And no doubt W.J. Knox said to him at some stage, you're not really 18, are you, Jimmy? The irony was that Jimmy wrote every day to his parents, and they wrote to him, but he never received one of their letters because all his letters to him went astray. So having threatened them with never writing to them, he thought they had never written to him, and he never received one before he died. And there's a book about that called Boy Soldier. But why do I mention that? Because there's a thread of connection there. Because W.J. Knox went on to Western Front, survived Fromelles, and was killed in August 1917 at Ypres. And he's buried at Le Martinga Cemetery near the border with France in Belgium. W.J. Knox had a daughter, just 2.5 years old. When he died, only child, and his daughter was my mum. So you get these little threads of connection, and that's what's powerful. And I was at his graveside again 6 or 7 weeks ago, and it's a very sad place, but you can feel the connections. Some of you will have been to Villers-Bretonneux, and we'll be coming up to the centenary of those battles next year. And this will be the Monash Centre, which the Commonwealth is spending a lot of money on. Whether they needed to do that or not, that's another question, but it'll be yet another place where Monash, his name is remembered. Monash, of course, he didn't think any of it was glorious. He wrote very about the tragedy of war, as did my mother's father. My grandfather wrote from Gallipoli, just as Monash did, and they all wrote about the misery. But if you look at the enlistments, 416,000 enlistments from Australia, and we wonder about 15 to 20 going to serve somewhere these days. 60,000 dead, 19,000 Victorians. It's virtually in equivalent terms an MCG full of those who never came back. And of course, of those who did come back, so many were in terrible shape, and that's where Monash really shone. He continued to ensure that the troops were looked after and the veterans were looked after. Most Victorians, and certainly most Australians, but most Victorians wouldn't realise that we have the shrine where it is because of Monash. I mentioned he went off and did all the commercial and civic things. He didn't engage in the politics, he didn't become dictator, but he did extraordinary things. And when the call went out for a memorial to the troops to build a shrine, it will come as a shock to you that Herald and Weekly Times ran a campaign as to where that should be. And it wasn't where the troops wanted it to be. And they were winning. That'll come as a shock to you. They were controlling the agenda and they were winning until Monash finally spoke up and said he wouldn't have a bar of it, and that's why we've got the shrine where it is. Funded by public subscription, which Monash generated, because he had the pull. He could pull 600,000 troops to an ANZAC Day march. He could pull former troops out to put down a police strike. He had the conviction and the support to do that, and the wisdom to reject being a dictator. He built Victoria's economic advantage for the 20th century. Sadly, we've let it go. Well, none of us probably know what it's going to be in the future. We now have records, push of a button, we can see who served with John Monash in his unit. Literally a push of a button. We know so much more by digitising the records. And we know where they lived. Another push of a button. These are the ones whose homes still exist. No plaques on any of them. There should be. We have a plaque available now, and there it is with the minister. It's one in Williamstown. We did some streets in Williamstown and elsewhere, some in Hawthorn as well. And if you look at that standard model, we just think about getting together on these commemorations. What about where the connections lay, where the threads finish? And if you start to map them out, we're clicking, we can start to divide them up by town or suburb. And in the red there you can see 430 boys from Oakley. This wasn't the most developed area 100 years ago, but you can see the others as well. And look at the ones in Richmond, 3,000 boys from Richmond. That street, Clifton Street, Richmond, it's only 3 blocks. And I think there's over 34 boys from that one street. And then when you map them out, it's staggering. Just in the part of Oakley, 198 boys in those streets. Look at those streets just in group, and that's just grouping some of them, boys in the streets. And you can do this with a push of a button. There's a website called the AIF Project. It's World War I devoted to Australians. Push of a button. And look around the Monash Federation Centre, which some of you will know, and look at some of the boys who served there and what happened to them. Some of you will recognise the names. Some of those names are still relevant names in the electorate. You'll see their names probably on church boards and school boards as well. And you can do so much more with them. On the first convoy, October 1914, click of a button gives you this information. These are the boys from Oakley who were on the first convoy, who left in October 1914. And you look at, we go back one page, Kathy, is it? Oh no, sorry, next page, Frank Brennan, isn't it? Is that the one I was looking at? Alonzo Box, first convoy, killed first day at Gallipoli. And as we zoom down, you'll see a number of them killed in those very first days, boys from Oakley. They should never be forgotten. We should find the threads. Where did they live? Do the houses still exist? So when you start to map, that yellow dot is Jimmy Martin's house in Mary Street in Hawthorn. That's just 3 or 4 of the streets in Hawthorn. Imagine what was going on in those streets at that time with the parents and families. This is in Wellington Street in Kew. Imagine what's happening in that street 100 years ago. We'll click through some little street in Toorak. 20 boys, 5 killed in action. It's a tiny little street. Wattle Tree Road, too many to actually map. 66 residences. A street in Hamilton. And it's got a bracket around the E's because again, it's a classic case of where the enlisting officers made spelling mistake, and even the boys made spelling mistakes. So you have to make a few judgments about that. Similar street name, but this one in Port Melbourne. What was happening in those streets? And this is one that is of particular interest, Baillieu Street in Kensington. And we do an exercise where we show people how this works and how you can find this information out. And there happened to be somebody in the audience named Baillieu, who actually happens to be the producer for the Could Have Been Champions, Andy Baillieu. So we put Baillieu into the box, and we came up with Baillieu Street, and then we ticked Baillieu Street, Kensington, and that's what came up. And Baillieu Street, Kensington is an interesting street. It's one-sided, it faces the railway line. So this is virtually every second house or virtually every house in the street. So what does that say about commemoration? What if, instead of worrying about ANZAC Day or November the 11th, which will take care of themselves, the people in that street got together and they got their kids to make plaques at school to put on the houses to honour those who served. And then they picked a date, perhaps a different date every year, relevant to those who served in those houses. And the kids got together with the families and had a commemoration locally in the street at a time that mattered to them. You know what? They would never, ever forget it. They might forget what happened on ANZAC Day last year. They'd never forget that they did that. That's a thread of connection. That's what we're trying to get people to do. We've had some people now pick this idea up, and they're doing it on a street-by-street basis, and you can do it in Oakley. You could do it anywhere there is some history attached to the streets. And this is by way of example. I mentioned before the stuff we get in our office. This is a beautiful self-published history of Captain Bert Curnow. Bert was a 23-year-old and he died in Pozières in France in 1915? Yeah, 16, August 16. What distinguished Bert's got a lot of self-published histories. Bert wrote beautiful letters and cards, and Bert took his own camera and sent the photographs home. And it's a beautiful history. But what sets it aside even apart from that is that in the back, his niece and nephew who wrote this, and that's his niece there in the middle of that shot, indexed every name mentioned in the book. So Janet approached me at an ANZAC Day service a couple of years ago and said, I thought you might like to have a copy of this book. And I thought, it's beautiful. It's another self-published history. Is there any more room on the shelf? So I'm flipping through it, and there, W.J. Knox. And ooh, shivers. Suddenly I'm connected to Bert Curnow. I'm connected to Janet Woolhouse, even just a little thread. There's something that we have in common. And then we're flipping through the book, and we saw that Bert came from Bendigo, but he lived in South Melbourne. And so we took him down to took Janet down to 150 Bank Street, South Melbourne, having written to the residents. And they didn't know about Bert Curnow, and Janet didn't know about them or the house. We put them together. They sat down over this. We had the local media turn up, and Janet and the girls who lived there discovered that they had a lot else in common. It was quite remarkable. And that simple connection of an address connected them forever, and the local media have a connection, and they told beautiful stories about it. That's what we mean by mean by connection. And we would love it if particularly the people of Monash could find it in their hearts to connect with Monash to the extent that they actually connect the younger generation. Now, I said before, there's nobody over 40 in this room, I understand that. But there's a temptation for all those people who've reached the age of 39 years and 11 and a half months and never move on, to do everything. To do the family history, to package it all up and give it to the grandchildren. That's the temptation. And you feel good about it. But what do the grandchildren do with it? Generally, they put it on the shelf and they forget it. What you can do, and you'll be staggered at the results, is go to grandchildren if you've got them and say, listen, I don't understand these computer things. They're too hard for me, but apparently there's this website called the AIF Project. And you can put a name in there, or you can put a street name in there, or a suburb name in there. Could you do that for me and see what you can find? And the kids will come back. It's very easy. They'll be all over it in a flash. And they'll come back to the information. They'll bring it to you. And the difference between having you deliver information to children and have children deliver information to you, as I'm sure you know, is powerful. They only believe the latter. They only identify with the latter. That's where they get their connection. If you do that, you will give them the thread of connection that they otherwise won't have. If you do it in your streets, you get them to do it, they'll have it for life. It's incredibly powerful. Monash is our greatest Australian. He's underrated in literature, in history. If it wasn't for Tim Fisher, he wouldn't even be in the War Museum in London. As it is, there's only a relatively small patch. Even in the ANZAC Centre, the federal government spent a lot of money on for the centenary of the first departure from Albany in Western Australia. The section on Monash is tiny. I couldn't believe it when I went there. So you've got to fly to Perth, you've got to get to Albany, then you've got to walk up the hill, and then you've got to pay $20 to get in. And there's a weeny little bit of Monash. And I'm sure it's not intended, it's just become the habit to not recognise Monash as it should be recognised. There isn't a feature film about Monash. Heaven forbid we've had a feature film about Paul Hogan. Good luck to him. We've had features, teleseries about the bloke with no ears. We've got nothing about John Monash. So we're very keen to have a feature film or a teleseries about Monash. It requires some funding. So we've agreed with the library today that before you leave, if you could put the title to your house on the table over there, Monash Library will look after it and we will use it to the benefit of the movie. But there are a couple of scripts done, and I was talking just last Friday night to one of Australia's greatest filmmakers. He's got another script in preparation. He's doing exactly what I've been doing, searching out money. I'm not attached to one script or the other, but we need the Monash tribute in a movie or a teleseries. It probably lends itself best to a teleseries. The story hasn't been told. There's a lot to tell about John Monash. Philip Mora has done a script. He's done a trailer. He lives in Hollywood. He understands Hollywood. His script is very powerful. In some respects, very confronting. But he's authorised us to just show you a little trailer he's got for his movie, which is tentatively called Whitewash. Before I finish, I just want to point out that there are some books written about Monash. The first one was a Geoffrey Searle book. It's been around for some time and it's very authoritative. There's a book Roland Perry wrote which is very easy to read and it's got extraordinary amounts of information in it, entitled The Outsider Who Won a War. There's a smaller book that that Cecil Edwards wrote, and Tim Fisher has written a book, and Tim's mission is to have Monash elevated to Field Marshal posthumously. A noble cause. I don't think it's going to happen. The RSL don't like posthumous rearrangement of things like that. There have been some international precedents. But I don't think it should happen myself, because you do that and you actually clean up the records of those who were against Monash. You let them off the hook. It's not going to change our view of Monash at all. You might honour him, but it actually cleans up the record of the others, and I think that's probably a downside. So I simply go back to where we started from. Contemplate when you go home today or tonight, who's the greatest Australian of all right now, and who's the greatest Australian ever? And when you're finished with that, ask yourself, who's the most respected leader in the world today? I have Monash up as the greatest Australian of all time. There's plenty of reason to think so. Somehow, we've got to get kids to understand that, and the best way to do that is to get them to do things for you, not you do things for them. Thanks very much.